Welcome to the Man Cave Podcast with Dan Casper.
He is Dr. Austin Crowe, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine. He was on a little bit earlier this week with a couple of his kiddos as well, but we got him back for a second time this week. Good morning, Austin. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing great.
Hey, I want to start off with, I know I mentioned it on the other day with you, but just to maybe kind of revisit it in case anybody didn't hear it. But I want to talk again about Jonathan Brooks, the Carolina running back who is from Texas. I know you're a big Texas Longhorns fan, so you're probably familiar with him. But he tore his ACL. He just got back from recovering from ACL, played a couple games, and he re-tore the same ACL. When that happens to somebody, is that just is it a longer recovery because it's the same injury and the same knee? Is it usually the same process? Is there any concern about will it heal properly, or is it pretty similar to somebody who tears the ACL the first time?
I mean, there are a lot of similarities to the first tear. I mean, as far as our surgical approach, when you look at recovery time, though, it tends to be a little longer. Unfortunately, the studies also bear out that re-injury rates are more common in the revision setting, meaning the second time around it's more likely to re-tear again. So it's kind of like if it happens once, bad deal, happens twice, you're starting to get more concerned. Additionally, there's always a concern about additional injuries that maybe we missed the first time. So maybe a collateral injury that's been dinged up. Certainly with two ACL tears, there's also a higher incidence of both cartilage and meniscal injury. And meniscal tears, if they're not addressed appropriately, or if they can't be addressed the way you want it to, that can also lead to higher recurrence rate as well. So it certainly is a more complex issue. The other thing is, when we reconstruct ACLs in these athletes, 99% of the time we're using their own tissue. Well, likely his first one was what's called a patellar tendon graft. You can't take the patellar tendon twice, so now you're saying, okay, we're going to go to a second graft. You can either go to the other knee and take a patellar tendon, which most of us try to avoid if possible, or you have to go to the quad or hamstring tendons on that same knee. And not that you can't do that, but now, of course, this leg has now been, two separate grafts harvested from it, two separate surgeries. Likely there's at least some level of cartilage or meniscal injury as well. So I realize it's a long-winded answer, but yes, it's a bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately recovery. I mean, when you recover from an ACL, I'm sure you have listeners right now that have been through it. I mean, even though we tell people it's going to be, 6, 9, 12 months at least till they're back, full go at sports, even then they can look at their legs and say, you can visibly see which leg is when they had surgery. There'll be atrophy of muscle. It's still not fully built up. So if they have another injury, that leg still never got back to 100%. So it's already starting a little bit behind the 8 ball. So it's a complex recovery process, absolutely, in a revision setting. And then surgically speaking, there's already tunnels that are there. So sometimes that's to your advantage, sometimes it's to your disadvantage. So occasionally we'll do a revision ACL where it either wasn't ours or even ours, and you look at it like, geez, maybe I should have put that tunnel slightly different, and that can make it a little more complex on the surgical side. So a lot of layers to it. But revision ACLs do work very well. I mean, there's still a high success rate, and we do a lot of them. So it's not like it's give up now. There's no chance he can come back. Absolutely not. But it's more to it, and certainly recovery could be a little bit more tricky.
Has there been any studies or any thoughts when it comes to ACLs, like if there's been more success with a cadaver or the options you mentioned, like from your hamstring or such? Has there been anything that's indicated one's better than the other?
Oh, there's tons and tons of research on that topic. So the first delineation is cadaver versus your tissue. So cadaveric grafts, the clear advantage is you're not harvesting anything, right? So if you have the ACL, like I mentioned, the three main grafts that we harvest from patients are either patellar tendon, quad tendon, or hamstring tendon. And so if you use cadaver, you don't have to harvest anything. So there's clear advantages to that. The disadvantage is it's pretty clear cut that in younger athletes, the re-tear rate is higher. So generally speaking, any young athlete, and by young I mean people in their 20s and 30s, teens, 20s, 30s, we generally do recommend using your own tissue. There are some reasons to go to cadaver, but for the most part, we look at using that. Now, Aaron Rodgers, who is never afraid to speak his mind, he, after his ACL reconstruction, which he had done in college, he was talking to the media and saying, oh, everyone should have cadaver. To me, that's another example of someone talking without knowing what they're talking about. I mean, the studies are very clear. There is a higher re-tear rate. But, again, it's not without its advantages, right? You're not harvesting anything. Now, if you talk about the three grafts that are autograft, meaning your own tissue, each of them has a relatively similar outcome. there are some subtle things in each direction that push us one way or the other. The gold standard for professional athletes for quite a while has been the patellar tendon graft. So for my athletes that I'm trying to get back to a high level, that's generally the graft that I use. But there's surgeons out there using both hamstring and quad tendon grafts that work well. I do all three of them, so I have the ability to do all three. So that's nice when I talk to my athletes. They may say, you know what, my sibling had this one, or my neighbor had this one, or my coach said this one. And so I can do all three of them. And it's nice that it allows the athlete to choose them. But there are disadvantages to each and advantages to each. So you kind of talk about it and see kind of a personalized choice for that.
You kind of read my mind, because I was going to ask you. I know you're exactly right, because Aaron always talked about his cadaver one over there. So when you were talking about the younger ones there, I was going to ask you about the Aaron one. So see, we're in sync right there. So
yeah, same wavelength there.
Sticking with knee injuries, I know this happened a couple weeks ago, but Christian McCaffrey, a PCL injury, which we talked about a few weeks ago with Jair Alexander. That Jair let it be known that his was a PCL injury. So it looks like he might play this weekend finally. Christian McCaffrey's already been ruled out for the rest of the season. And if you watch that replay, I know it was a couple weeks ago, he ran, kind of fell down, but then he played another one and gave himself up. And that's kind of, everybody's like, oh boy, non-contact injury, and ended up being a PCL injury. Is it safe to say that Christian's maybe was a little bit more severe than Jair's, whereas they already ruled out Christian for the rest of the year?
I think so. I mean, there's layers to that, right? I mean, CMC is just a phenomenal athlete, but boy, he has kind of been a China doll. And I know we've talked about that. That's like, is there such thing as being injury prone? And as you know, I'm not a huge believer in that, but sometimes it's like, wow. So I think if you look at just what he's been through and coming off other injuries, they may be more likely to say, look, we're just going to shut him down, and they have so much money invested in him. And let's be honest, their season is not looking great right now. So I think that's probably part of it. But looking at the severity of the tear, I'm sure that's a huge portion of it. So the combination of the physical exam and saying, like, how loose is that PCL, and then what it looks like on the MRI, how high it was, the grade of injury. So, like, is it 10%, 50%? It's hard to actually quantify that, but we get a gestalt of it. So I think those play into it. And then any additional injuries. So was there a meniscus tear with it? Is there a bad bone bruise? And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is how he feels. And clearly we all saw him go down. So the injury wasn't on that play. That play occurred, the injury occurred earlier, because PCLs usually are going to be a direct blow to the front of the knee. Most common in football players is actually when they'll fall onto a flexed knee. We also call it like a dashboard injury. So people in car accidents, they'll take a hit to the shin, and it drives the tibia back. And that's how they injure the PCL. In this case, obviously, there's hopefully not cars driving on the football field, so it ends up being the knee hitting the ground. And that's how they think he tore his PCL. So he tries to make a cut on that knee, and it wasn't even a cut. I mean, I think he was just trying to run, and then we all saw him just go down. And you're right, everyone just holds their breath, because that's always the worst thing. I mean, as much as a horrific tackle, or legs are twisted, those are bad. When you see that non-contact people go down, you usually know it's a significant injury. So honestly, all things considered, PCL tears are very different than other ligament injuries, specifically ACL, because the ability to heal is there. So the hope is he rehabs it and gets back to 100%. And I think that's a realistic goal with a partial PCL like that.
With the four knee ligaments, is if you had to rank them, is the PCL the one that's maybe the rarest or the toughest one to tear, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm sure there's studies on it, and I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head. I mean, MCLs are the most common. So MCL tears we see a lot of, and they heal really well. ACLs are probably second. The LCL, which we actually bundle together in what's called the posterior lateral corner. So the posterior lateral corner and PCLs, those are probably 3 and 4. I don't know exactly which one's more rare, to be honest, but they're both less common than ACLs and MCLs. And then, of course, there's the combination injuries, so what we call multi-ligament knee injuries. And so those unfortunately happen as well. Those are certainly higher grade. And you almost always will require reconstruction. So PCLs in posterior corners, those are a little bit less common, and usually we'll see those in combination. So that is actually a common combination of a PCL in a posterior corner or ACL in a posterior corner injury. So yeah, they're less common, but the PCL, like I mentioned, does have the ability to heal itself. So when we see it, people can bounce back, and so it also doesn't garner as much attention, because often people don't require a reconstruction, so they miss a handful of games and they come back and play, as opposed to the dreaded season-ending surgery, which we often see with the ACL tears.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One of the more common injuries we've talked about outside of ACLs has been Achilles. And one player last night's game, San Francisco Greenlaw, returning from his Achilles tear that he suffered during the Super Bowl. He wasn't able to finish the game. They said he had a sore knee. But, Achilles-wise, general, I mean, we see Kirk Cousins this year. He's struggling a little bit. Obviously, the other quarterback with the Jets in New York too. And then,
remember his name.
And then Greenlaw. What is the biggest one? Because you got these guys coming back from Achilles injuries and such, and we've seen other players attempt that too. But generally, what is the biggest obstacle for these players when they get back on the field or when they get back on the court? What's that biggest obstacle they got to clear and maybe get back to the type of athlete they are when they're recovering from these Achilles injuries?
I honestly, I think it's half physical, half mental. I mean, I think when we look at these injuries, I think we discount the mental portion of it, where people trust it, where they're able to take that explosive step in whether it's basketball jumping, whether it's football cutting and pivoting, and sprinting. I mean, those are things that those guys are putting their bodies right on the edge of what the human body is capable of doing, and so they have to be able to trust it. And so, after going through an injury like that, there's that lurking concern that it's going to happen again. And so I don't care how tough you are, that's like in your head. And so there's that portion of it. Now, physically speaking, I mean, often within 3 to 6 months, there's excellent healing of the tendon itself, but you're also building the muscle back up, right? So as we all know, the tendon is just the anchor for the muscle belly. So the tendon functions to insert a muscle to a bone so it can impart its action. So when the muscle contracts, it pulls the tendon, which then pulls the bone, and then it does what it's supposed to do. So in this case, it plantar flexes the foot. So when you have the Achilles injury, I mean, anyone out there that's had it or knows someone has it, when we first take off the splint, I mean, the calf muscle is just evaporated. I mean, just the amount of atrophy is just striking. So that's one of the goals of rehab, is that we build it back up as quickly as possible and safely as possible. And so getting them back to kind of getting some good muscle strength and muscle tone, and then again, trusting it. So I think that's all part of it. And then with that, you decondition the leg. So it's not like you can just isolate and be like, all right, we're going to shut off the Achilles, but we're going to use the rest of the leg. You can't do that. So that's why these guys come back. And to have something like Greenlaw saying, like the knee is sore, it may be hamstring or patellar tendonitis, quad tendonitis, any of those things, because that leg has been shut down and now it's building itself back up and you're getting irritation somewhere else. So we do see that relatively commonly. It could be any one of those things, but to get back 100%, I mean, it's a long recovery from a major injury like that. And so for those guys, it's just getting the leg physically there and mentally there. It just takes a long time.
Last question for you. This goes to we have a Packers tight end that returned to practice this week, nearly 11 weeks after he last played in a game, and he indicated the other day that he had surgery on a torn ligament in his left ankle that Dr. Robert Anderson performed from him. So when you hear 11 weeks and then a torn ligament in his ankle, we talk about sprained ankles and high ankle sprains and that sort of thing, but that seems like a longer recovery time than just a high ankle sprain surgery, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly what ligament. I mean, by far the most common ligament surgery would be the lateral, what's called the ATFL, so the anterior talofibular ligament. So that's called the Brostrom procedure. So those are very common. We do a lot of them. Probably the second most common would be the high ankle, and then probably third would be the deltoid, which is on the medial or inner part of the ankle. So it would be one of those three. And truth be told, I'm not sure which one he had done. With that injury pattern, again, assuming it's the ATFL, that would be a quick recovery. I'm wondering if this was more of a high ankle, so the syndesmosis, where we do those. I think we've talked about it with a couple other athletes. I've said what's called a tightrope procedure, where we kind of squeeze the bones together. Perhaps that's what he had done. I don't know, but that one you could potentially bounce back faster if it was a partial, because then you had some ligaments that were still present. But to get back 11 weeks after doing a Brostrom or a deltoid reconstruction, man, that would be, really an accelerated recovery process. Now these guys are, in the Bob Anderson is world renowned.
Mm-hmm.
But even so, I can't imagine Bob would let him come back that quickly. So if I had to bet, I wonder if this was a high ankle injury and he had a tightrope procedure, and that allowed him to get back on an accelerated timeline. But hard to say for sure. I could research that and see if I can figure it out.
Interesting. Good stuff as always. I was going to ask you too, because next week, since we're both, huge Aaron Rodgers fans, do you want to have a watch party for his documentary that's dropping next week on Netflix?
Absolutely. What else would we rather do?
Right. He's Dr. Austin Crowe, Chippewa Valley Orthopedics and Sports Medicine. Always appreciate the time, buddy. Stay warm. Enjoy the week. Best of luck to the kiddos and their hoops games coming up here too. So we'll catch up with you soon. Okay, bud?